context sort of fits in within this. I think this panel is actually really a nice way to address any kind of emerging biotechnology, regenerative medicine, and stem cells included within that. Because we had science, we had ethics, we're going to have law, policy, sort of local context. And it's a really nice way to look at the issue from multiple levels and how they intersect. And this really, sort of this background primer is a little basic, but I offer this partly because I'm always defensive. I'm a lawyer and I work in a medical center. So I'm always trying to say how we're not so bad. And we really, there is a reason we do what we do. But really, if you situate this panel, science is telling us what we can do, what technically is capable. And when we're talking about ethics, we're trying to figure out as a society where do we come down and what we should do. Law kind of takes those two and says, what can we do? You know, what are we allowed to do legally? But it comes from somewhere. And it tries to come from, at least, what we should do. It tries to reflect the ethical thinking. It also tries to reflect the science and keep up with the times. It is not always perfect. It is sometimes too blunt an instrument for these things. But there is a context to what it's trying to do. And this all works out within a policy context about what are we actually going to do with competing values and principles at play. And this is because I know Sean has his nice funky picture, so I had to have a funky picture. What's really pathetic about this is that I could actually not do this myself. The research assistant in my office had to help me figure out how to take what I had drawn and make this into reality. But yeah, I can't even get this. I'm not very technically savvy. But there are different levels. When we think about legal issues, it's not just that there are different issues we have to think about. We also have to think about the different layers where law will come in. It may, or policy, it may be at an institutional level, which is a little more about policy, or there are ethical review boards or oversight committees. And that's influenced a lot of times by the state. And in healthcare and this medical research, particularly in stem cell research, where the feds have been slow getting out of the gate about stepping up and being influential here, the states have taken the lead in how they're going to sort of regulate what's happening. So they're very influential. And here's where the concepts of federalism come in, that there may be certain limits on what states could do, but they may be able to do more. There may be things left to the states that the federal government doesn't have much of a say in. The federal government, obviously, with President Obama's recent work and what NIH is doing, are going to become more influential. It's going to be interesting to see how the federal-state sort of mix with all these regulations works. And of course, we also have to think about the international context of what's going on. So when we think about the trajectory of our legal issues, really, it's gone from, is it okay? We've kind of, most states, and now the federal government is getting beyond this idea about is it okay? And Bonnie talked a little bit about derivation and use, to if we're going to say it's okay, and we're going to fund this work, then how are we going to regulate it? How are we going to think about what the limits are on what we're going to allow? And particularly from the law, there's been a lot of interest in how are we going to deal with ownership of what we're creating or doing. And not just of the personal, sort of when we talk about the embryos or gametes, but also the products, the stem cell lines we're creating, the methods we're creating to derive stem cells, and how are we going to sort of commercialize that at work. Again, sort of when we think about these legal issues, I just want to reinforce that we have to think about things happening at a local or state level, federal, and all this institutional, because there are a lot of different sort of regulations and pressures that are coming from all that. And we have to think about sort of in the U.S., this particular mix about state and federal work. Permissibility, just really briefly, this has been touched upon, and Jim will talk about it. But we really, it's been about, what will we fund? And how and when. And there's been some movement, I will leave it to Jim to talk a little bit about some of the sort of the nuances of these policies. But really where we're at now is that we are going to fund it, the federal government's going to fund it, the states have really stepped up in the interim when the federal government wasn't funding a lot, as we know in New York State and a lot of other states and are funding things. And with that funding there obviously always come strings attached, which is why you had all those governors saying, in particular states, we don't want Obama's economic recovery money. The same here, with money for stem cell research, there are strings about how are we going to regulate matters. At the state level, most states now actually allow stem cell research of some form. Although it's interesting, there has been a recent pushback. There are some states now that are introducing legislation that would actually start to limit some of the stem cell research. And it might just be because it's becoming more of a news item, and so you get some legislators in certain states thinking this might be something interesting to propose. But there definitely has been some movement. But most of this stem cell research legislation is tied to approaches that states take to cloning or abortion. It gets tied up into a lot of that, which makes it sort of sometimes tricky. But there is more and more support for stem cell research. The issues become what are okay sources for the stem cells, adult or embryonic, or we're talking about IPS. And if we're looking at embryonic, what are okay sources that will allow from embryonic, which could be their discarded excess embryos, or we can allow creating that gets a lot more tricky about creating. Internationally, I just wanted to mention really quickly, there have been certain countries that have been much more sort of liberal or maybe less regulatory burdensome in their approaches to this, which is why we've seen some research sort of shift to other countries, which also will make things very interesting, because if they have different regulations and permissibility than we may have, it makes it difficult to think about how are we going to allow cross-border research participation and collaboration, and what does that mean for whatever is developed. If they do certain things that we don't allow, can our researchers do that? Can we actually bring those products back into our states? But internationally, you've seen a lot come out of the UK. They are actually probably a little more liberal and permissive around this, and have a very strong regulatory authority there. Canada is sort of middle ground, not into cloning, but is permitting embryonic stem cell research. In the Asia and Pacific Rim, Singapore, China, and India actually are very regulation-light, if you will. So there's a lot of advancement in those nations. Japan and South Korea because it had its own little hiccups a few years ago, you may recall, one of the research was with some research misconduct about who donated embryos, which I'll get to in a little bit, to research, but they have a little more regulation. But particularly like Singapore and China and India, we're seeing that they might start to become where you see a lot of this stem cell research happening, because there isn't as much regulation. And even in the Middle East, Iran and Israel have actually been at the vanguard of doing things. When we're thinking about these, as I mentioned, there is regulation sort of at these different levels about when we fund things, how are we going to regulate it. The NIH is really interested in thinking about what is funded and what is its oversight around that. For instance, President Obama just said, okay, we're going to allow federal funding for a broader array of embryonic stem cells, but left it to the NIH to develop guidelines in consideration of science and ethics, and not about, okay, what are we actually going to allow, and how could this research proceed? And the NIH has just issued draft guidelines, which Jim will probably get to, but that's a place that federal funders or federally funded projects will really have to look at and follow these NIH guidelines. The FDA, doesn't matter what kind of funding you had, this also can get various other sources of funding, but the FDA is looking at the products. The methods you use, or whatever sort of cell types are developed or researched, like the FDA trial that was just approved, it's going to regulate that. So as this science moves from what's in our thoughts and our theories and actually moves into reality, the FDA will become more active. It just in January of 2009, earlier this year, approved its first embryonic stem cell related trial of Geron. It's just a very small trial. It's a safety trial, but it took 10 years to get there. It took Geron about $45 million over the course of that to get it to that point. And that's really being watched because it's sort of innovative. I mean, it's blazing the path of figuring out how is the FDA going to handle regulating this kind of stuff. FDA also gets involved. A lot of the early stem cells were on, they were mouse feeder cells, so we thought maybe it could regulate those as a xenotransplantation product. So, I mean, the FDA has other ways of trying to influence what's going on, particularly as we look at commercialization. The National Academies of Science is sort of ethical advisory group. They, particularly during the Bush administration when the federal government wasn't funding as much embryonic stem cell research at any level, the National Academies of Science came out and started to talk about, well, here are guidelines that we think that people should follow. And they were very influential because a lot of states have looked at those National Academy of Science guidelines and incorporated those into their regulations, whether they're around consent or compensation of donors. They really have looked at the National Academy of Science. And again, the legislature is getting active, and Jim will get to that. 2 minutes? Okay, I'll move on. Us lawyers, we don't have to talk. The emerging legal focus, really quickly, is around, I have it as 3 C's, because I was trying to figure out what's an easy way to sort of remember this. And it really goes to commodification, commercialization, and collaboration, which I'll deal with. Commodification really is this donation stuff. And it really is where you'll see law really being influenced by these ethical considerations. We're looking at, there's international consensus actually around the idea that we really want informed consent. When people are donating their embryos for research, or donating gametes that would go to embryos for research, there should be consent. It should be informed. California, actually, regulations want not just information to be disclosed, but they actually have 8 measures where they want to make sure that people comprehend what's happening. Particularly for oocyte donors, the egg donors, that's a very complicated process. They want to make sure people understand the risks and burdens, that they're not going to financially gain. They're not supposed to be able to say, well, I only want this to go to help my relative that has X disease. I mean, it really has to go sort of to a general science. So there is a lot of consensus around informed consent. Compensation, as we heard, is a lot trickier. There is increasing acceptance that we will allow compensation for lost wages for people who go through this whole process, potentially for insurance coverage or medical coverage. But there are different opinions, and the reason I bring this up is when states, particularly looking at our U.S. level, when states come out in different ways, it makes it tricky because if New York researchers are working with California researchers, and we have different takes on this, how do regulations influence or impede upon science where they may have different views about who could be compensated for what? And real quickly on the commercialization chain, there's just a lot of levels from isolating stem cells, cultivating, developing preclinical trials, clinical trials, coming up with products and processes. At each of those, people are starting to seek and obtain, particularly in Wisconsin, WARF, get patents on what they're doing. And that influences, especially the more upstream it is, what happens downstream, because it makes it a little trickier. People have to get licenses, royalties may go back, and it increases the cost, the transaction cost for doing research, and may work in a way where it's not that patent law or commercialization is wrong, but that it may work in a way that impedes science, particularly for young, smaller businesses or people that are later into the game. It may make them think it's very costly to get into this kind of research. The uncertainty of regulation, too, around if different states have different views about licensing schemes, if different countries have different patents on things, that can be a barrier to scientific development. Also, these competing ethical views have been a barrier to investment. There's some people who have been, especially venture capital, has stayed away a little bit from some of the embryonic. That may shift now, but we do see a lot of interest in IPS. Bohr recently introduced that he's giving, I think, $20 million to an IPS study. So ethics does matter. I am over it and I'm going. So really the thought about intellectual property and physical property, I just have up here, intellectual property and patents is really federal law. Physical property and these licenses, you get a lot of state law. There are, like the ISSCR, an international group, has developed model material transfers agreements because we are trying to harmonize regulation around this. But we really do have to think about, in the US we're sort of out of the gate, we say we can patent. The European Union is much more different. They really look at morality around this. But we're allowing patenting, we're saying how can we limit it? Can the government, for instance, retain certain licensing rights? It has done this, for instance, with Wisconsin, the WARF. It developed a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, saying that we retain certain rights and we can force you to give certain licenses, or for less cost. really to make sure that we can advance the science and it doesn't just become about profit, but it also becomes about our research end goals. And this really has led to the collaboration issue with this sort of international, national, state thicket of regulations, thicket of patents where people can get a patent on multiple levels of the research, which makes it hard to sort of collaborate because you're not sure who you have to get an okay from and what and how much you have to pay. It raises issues about collaboration at many different levels, and those are things that we just have to think about. And so really just as at the end, my comments would be that I think we want to look at what's happening, we want to clarify what's out there, and think about, from a legal standpoint, are our regulations or are our legal approaches, what are the benefits, but what are the potential harms? Have we thought about what we might be slowing down, what extra burdens we may be applying? Maybe we want to do that, maybe we want to slow certain things down, but we have to be mindful of the consequences, intended or not, of what we're doing. It's good there's been a call for a public repository of regulations, developing model guidance or laws. Not that we want everyone has to act sort of the same way. The innovation or the different approaches may be helpful, but how can we think about making sure that we can harmonize things in a way that we can have cross-state, cross-nation collaboration and inform and guide ourselves. And we want to make sure that the law is part of this discussion while we promote collaboration. It's important to have the law there because we are developing these regulations. And once we develop laws, it's hard to change them. So it's good to make sure that we're being informed and we're not developing laws where we don't want to. And when we do, we've given really thought to the science and the ethics and the policy around this. And with that,
Okay, I think it's my job in this is to kind of, given all of this, what's just happened to stem cell policy and what's likely to happen moving forward, kind of how much change has there really been. And there were a lot of expectations raised during the presidential campaign that an Obama administration would change